Goliath Curse. The history and future of societal collapse. My name is Jonas Meckling. I'm a professor of energy and environmental policy on campus, and I lead the climate group of the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative. Before I introduce Luke Kemp, who will be our speaker today, a few words on why we are having this talk today. So this book that Luke is presenting came out in the UK this summer, and the Guardian wrote a book review that I read. And it resonated with me with something in the classroom, the eco-anxiety among students, this sense of that climate change is impacting their daily lives and will more so in the future. And a recent poll of US residents, 15 to 29-year-olds, found that 63% are feeling some eco-anxiety. It's a diffuse feeling. And here is someone, Dr. Doom, as his nickname is, to take this on in an analytical way and offer us some analytical tools to think about this worst-case scenario of societal collapse. So for me, this is kind of a point where hearts and minds meet and really interesting conversation can happen. And I'm absolutely thrilled that Luke could join us here all the way from the UK, exactly 1 week after the launch of the US launch of his book. Luke is a research affiliate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. He has consulted and done foresight studies with a number of international organizations, such as the World Health Organization and the Convention on Biological Diversity, and holds a PhD from the Australian National University. He has now written a magnum opus, Goliath Curse, that kind of has the breadth of some of these big history books like Yuval Harari's Sapiens or Jared Diamond's Germs and Steel, and they'll definitely spark conversation today and beyond this room. So I'm thrilled you're here, Luke. Please join me in welcoming Luke Kemp to Berkeley.
Thank you for the introduction, Jonas, and thank you to the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative for hosting me. Despite the Dr. Doom moniker, I'm hoping that most of you will not leave this room feeling depressed. So I've come from the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, known as CSER at the University of Cambridge. And there's obviously a question here of why would someone who's trying to think through large-scale catastrophe in the future, which is what CSER studies, essentially any catastrophe that could lead to global societal collapse or human extinction, why look at the past? 7 years ago, when I first entered the field, it became quite apparent that whenever people thought about the future, they thought about some kind of catastrophe, whether it be nuclear war, AI, or climate change, there were always assumptions both about human nature and also about the long trajectory of human societies that were underpinning their visions of the future. If you think technology is the driver of progress, as Bill Gates once famously said, that's a historical claim in many ways. If you think that humans, by nature, as soon as any kind of edifice of authority, whether it's a state or an empire, is pulled away, suddenly become selfish, brutal, that's also something of a historical claim as well. So this book, in many ways, is supposed to interrogate those assumptions we take when thinking about the future. I want to start with a case study some of you may know, many may not. Who's heard of Cahokia? Okay, more than I'm used to. So Cahokia is located on the outskirts of St. Louis, roughly 500 kilometers southwest of modern-day Chicago. It's currently a set of roughly 200 mounds. The largest, Monk's Mound, stands taller than the White House. These mounds previously were, around about 1,000 years ago, flat-topped earthen pyramids. They laid out around a larger plaza, and they were part of what was the US's first city. Roughly 10,000 to 15,000 people were in Cahokia at one stage. And these mounds were not just pyramids. They, inside of them, contain some very unique artifacts. Large-scale human sacrifice. One of the mounds, Mound 72, contains over 200 sacrificial victims, I think 272 to be precise. And some of these were quite large-scale burials as well. There's one of 53 women, including 52 of reproductive age, who were all buried at the same time. Some of the victims were decapitated, others had their hands chopped off. Some kept their hands, but you can actually see their fingernails digging into the earth as they were buried alive. At the top of the pyramid are two men who are both encased in a sheath of 20,000 shell beads. So not only was this the first city, but in many ways it was starting to become the first state. A society where there's a clear distinction between the rulers and the ruled. So Cahokia began roughly 1,000 years ago with what was called the Big Bang. Essentially, corn is imported into the area, roughly 900 CE. Then suddenly, kind of 1050 CE, the city explodes into formation. The pyramids were literally made by people taking handfuls of dirt and piling them together into these large-scale pyramids. But then, roughly 100 years later, it starts to fall apart. Palisades are erected around the center. The large-scale farming complex to the north also begins to be abandoned. And then roughly within 2 centuries, Cahokia is no more. It's more or less largely abandoned. The area around the Mississippi for a couple of 100 square kilometers becomes known as the vacant quarter. It's largely avoided by the indigenous people. Eventually it is resettled prior to European occupation, but for a couple of 100 years, it's abandoned, left to rot as a bad memory in the swamps of the Mississippi. And perhaps most striking is, Cahokia never has an oral tradition built around it. There's no big mythologies, stories, narratives about this city, which seems kind of strange, right? And it's worthwhile noting that, and this is just quickly a quick little schematic of the vacant quarter. It's worthwhile noting that Cahokia was not alone. At roughly the same time as it went up, there were actually other large-scale borderline cities, at the very least hierarchical societies across the US. This is a picture of Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon in the southwest United States, of the Pueblo people, who were probably the first farmers of the United States in the southwest United States. There's also Moundville, so there's several other kind of mound, flat-topped, earthen pyramid-based societies across the Appalachians, including across Alabama, Tennessee, and other areas. So we have Cahokia, Moundville, also the Huhugam, who, very similar to Cahokia, have flat-topped earthen pyramids, large-scale irrigation, and around the pyramids often surround these large-scale plazas. The story here is essentially that you have the importation of corn, maize, from previously Mesoamerica, so the Zapotec and the Maya, for instance. They import corn up through the US Southwest and along the Mississippi, and wherever the corn seems to grow, you often seem to have these societies pop up. Sometimes they seem to also leave certain kinds of ideas. Obviously, the idea of building flat-top pyramids, sacrificing people to legitimize rulership, that seems kind of similar to what both the Zapotec, the Maya, and others did as well. So there is an emerging story here of not only did resources flow through the US Southwest and up the Mississippi, but so did a certain kind of social blueprint, or at least parts of it. And all of these different societies start to collapse around about the same time. The beginning of the Little Ice Age, as it's called, which is a series of pulses of cooling across the Northern Hemisphere around about 1 degree Celsius. And notably, while Cahokia was forgotten, there are oral traditions about these other sites. So for instance, the Puebloans have the story of the great gambler, that essentially a god came down to them, one who was preternaturally good at gambling, to the extent that basically the god was so effective at gambling that he eventually won over the men, women, and children, much the property of the Puebloans, and in return demanded they build him great houses, including Pueblo Bonito. That was until eventually they aligned themselves with a set of other gods and overthrew him in a great revolution. Then the Huhugam have a similar story about a cultural hero they have called Elder Brother. An elder brother is sidelined, marginalized, and almost killed by a group of ruling priests, until eventually, once again, the people align themselves with Elder Brother and do a great revolution, overthrowing the evil priestly class. And last but not least, the Cherokee, who cover some of the same areas as kind of the Appalachian early mound sites, they have the story of the Inequality, who were essentially a group of, once again, wizard priests who ruled over them, until eventually they too were overthrown because they were becoming too oppressive and too demanding of the common people. So it's notable that across all of these, they're either actively forgotten, in the case of Cahokia, or they're remembered as somewhat bad experiments in hierarchy, almost as a kind of cautionary tale of sorts. I think these early case studies, often forgotten, of the earliest what I would call Goliaths, or what some people call civilizations, raise some really good questions, including why did these form in the first place? Why was corn so instrumental in the organization of these early societies across the US? Why did they collapse? Was it simply just a little ice age? And what does it mean for our future? And I'll be working through each of these questions using the US case studies, but also a much broader historical tapestry as well. And given that we only have less than an hour to work through this, I'll be skimping on the details, but the book has over 1,000 endnotes, so you can feel free to consult it, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion as well. Before we move on, I just want to quickly talk about this term Goliath. When I first started the book, it became a question of what is collapsing? And usually people would say civilization. And yet, what is civilization? And despite reading many books on it, I can never come to a good definition of what exactly is civilization. Some people put forward the idea that it's a kind of checklist of different factors. So this is very famously done by the Australian archaeologist Gordon Childe, who said it's 10 factors, including things like writing, long-distance trade, which all hunter-gatherers have, and worth noting that writing wasn't had by large empires like the Incan, for instance, who stretched all the way from Argentina to Chile. But essentially, the checklist just doesn't quite work. Others would say it's an advanced culture, which is about as vague and capacious as it is biased towards indigenous people. And of course, civilization has, let's face it, always been a term of propaganda. It comes from the Latin root civilitas, which has connotations of political wisdom, virtue, restraint, moderation. If one looks at Cahokia and the large-scale human sacrifices occurring, or as we'll see, the fact that warfare seems to precede the formation of essentially all the earliest states and civilizations, why would we call that civilized? Patriarchy, warfare, slavery, these are common to pretty much all the earlier states and kingdoms, but it's very difficult to see that as civilized per se. Instead, the commonality across all of these is their dominance hierarchies. When archaeologists look for the earlier states, what they're looking for are top-down chains of command to militaries and a separation between rulers and ruled, with the rulers, of course, taking more of the resources than the ruled have. It is a switch towards a form of organization in which a small group are ranked above others and use that to impose rules and extract resources. I call that Goliath. Goliath, of course, harkens back to the biblical tale of a domineering Philistine warrior who essentially rules through force, but is also surprisingly fragile and dates back to the Bronze Age. So it works in multiple ways. So let's start with rise. Why did these Goliaths rise up in the first place? For me, this is a really important question. As Aristotle once said, if you would understand anything, observe its beginning and its development. If we can understand why these societies arose in the first place, we can get a good idea of what their purpose was and potentially what that means for our future. And that takes us back a fair way. So I go all the way in the book back to the Middle Paleolithic, roughly 300,000 years ago, which seems to be when our species first began, modern-day Homo sapiens sapiens. And importantly, this becomes a question also somewhat of human nature, as some people would call it, or as I'd call it, our evolutionary inclinations. Most of us, when we think about collapse, we're pretty intimately influenced by one particular philosopher. Anyone know this guy? Yep, Thomas Hobbes, 17th century philosopher, who put forth the idea that when humans are in their state of nature, in other words, they're not being ruled by authority structures such as states or empires, then their lives are nasty, brutish, and short. We're solitary, we tend to fight each other, and we're incapable of doing large-scale cooperative endeavors without having authority structures. And of course, that colors all our visions of collapse, whether it's Mad Max, for instance, The Road. They all have a Hobbesian vision that when things go wrong, people engage in a violent scramble for resources. And of course, this in many ways is one particular vision of how the Paleolithic should be. Yet when you actually look at the archaeological and anthropological evidence, which Hobbes didn't really have access to, things look quite different actually. So one thing that really sets us humans apart from other early hominids is our diversity. And by this I mean the ability for us to move across groups and share culture, genes, tools, etc. So contrary to popular belief, people in nomadic egalitarian groups don't tend to just live in kind of small ragtag groups of families. In modern day nomadic egalitarians, less than 10% of the group is usually closely related at a kind of familiar level. You often have people who come from very different groups and speak entirely different languages. The average individual, both in modern day hunter-gatherers and from what we can tell in the deep past, probably would have known thousands of individuals because they wouldn't be moving across different groups so frequently. That constant churn of individuals across different groups meant there was a lot of sharing of culture, genes, instruments, and tools. To the extent that you get these great cultural zones like the Aurignacian culture roughly 41,000 years ago, where essentially all the way from Siberia through to Spain, you have evidence of shared figurines, shared types of lithic tools, so stone instruments, and shared types of artwork as well. This is pretty common. You also have the Clovis culture here in modern day North America. We're basically, not modern day, but in North America, we basically have very similar lithic technologies, in particular arrowheads and blades, which seem to be shared all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. Even in Africa, roughly 120,000 years ago, we have evidence of shared musical instruments, tools, lithics, and genes from the East Coast of Africa through to the West Coast. And it's worth noting that this is probably the reason why we survive while others die out. So there's been a lot of speculation around why the Neanderthals died. Probably the most kind of famous one is that we killed them off. There's very little evidence of that. There's only actually 2 skeletons that have been found that have any signs of kind of projectiles, parry fractures, any signs of violence. And in those cases, we don't know if sapiens did it. It could have been an accident. It could have been another Neanderthal. Instead, the leading theory across at least one sample of 216 paleoanthropologists is demography. They were kind of the opposite of us. They had very small fragmented groups. At least in one burial case of a group of, I think, 24 Neanderthals, we found that they had a genetic diversity similar to modern-day endangered mountain gorillas, which meant very small fluctuations in the birth or death rate could mean that an individual group could die out quite quickly. Again, we were the opposite, which is one of the reasons why we managed to survive a cold snap in Europe while the Neanderthals did not. It would be very hard to have these big shared zones of culture if we were constantly killing each other. No one likes to trade across a war zone. And yet, of course, the popular kind of idea is that we are inherently very violent. And what comes up quite frequently is this idea that when we're nomadic egalitarians in the Paleolithic, we had roughly a 15 to 25% violence rate. In other words, for every 100 people, around about a quarter would die at the hands of another individual. That's both the conclusion of a whole bunch of different historians, and obviously most famously Steven Pinker in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. It's worthwhile noting that Pinker, who draws upon some of the previous books here, his dataset has 3 duplicates. 3 of his sites only have 1 body, 1 has none of any signs of violence. And importantly, there's only 1 of those sites which is actually from the Paleolithic, so from beyond 12,000 years ago. That's a site called Jebel Sahaba, which is in modern-day Sudan. And importantly, Jebel Sahaba happens when the Earth is warming. It's going through a very environmentally tumultuous period. And that area in particular essentially is being cleft in half with a big valley forming in between. So not exactly a good indicator of what most of the Paleolithic was like. That site had, I think, 52 different skeletons with signs of violence, but that's the only one we can find across the Paleolithic. In a survey of 3,000 skeletons, 400 sites, 2 archaeologists at the Field Museum, Haas and Pistelli, they only couldn't find 6 different sites which had any signs of violence whatsoever across 300,000 years. 4 of the sites had people embedded with projectiles. We can't tell if they were killed in a hunting accident or something else. 1 was a triple burial, but no signs of violence, so it could have been ceremonial. And the only remaining site was once again Jebel Sahaba. It's worthwhile noting that I'll focus mainly on this, but there's a whole bunch of other lines of evidence I mentioned in the book, including, for instance, while we're often compared to chimpanzees who seem to have some signs of warfare, for instance. Chimpanzees, in almost every case of warfare, it's due to either habitat destruction or human interference. And additionally, chimpanzees are different to us. Genetically, they have a whole bunch of adaptations. They're calmer during conflict, for instance, and they actually heal their wounds quicker than we do. And all of those happen after our last common ancestor. In other words, it seems chimpanzees are actually much more violent than us. Pretty much all the evidence points towards us being relatively pacifist overall. And importantly, this has pretty big implications which gel really well when we look at modern-day disaster risk. In studies of modern-day disaster risk management, whether it's looking at tornadoes, hurricanes, terrorist attacks, earthquakes, there's this idea that mass panic is a myth. That despite most popular depictions of people falling into disorder as soon as there's a disaster, people during disasters actually tend to be very pro-social, altruistic, and very good at self-organizing. Who's heard of boat lift? Hey, okay, a couple people, that's good. So boat lift is essentially what happens in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The Coast Guard puts out a call for a large-scale evacuation of Manhattan across the Hudson River, and people respond. There's a movement of over 500,000 people in the space of a few hours. It's the largest scale maritime evacuation, even larger than Dunkirk. That was done just through the Coast Guard putting out one call and everyday people responding. And that's just one kind of, granted, very thematic example, but this tends to happen all the way back to even, say, for instance, the Great Earthquake of San Francisco. People tend to respond pro-socially. And you even kind of see this during what people would call collapse events. So in 1991, the Barre regime falls apart in Somalia. What's most striking is a decade later, Somalia actually looks better. So infant mortality is dropped by 24%, maternal mortality by 30%, and extreme poverty by 20%. The leading theory is that in the case of Somalia, you were better off under more local, often decentralized regimes, including local government and even local warlords, than you were under the predatory Barre regime. And there's other benefits to collapse as well. I've tried to keep the memes to a minimum, but I still stuck a couple in. So the question, of course, becomes, if we're relatively good at self-organizing, and if we're egalitarian by nature, what happened? And it's worthwhile just taking a quick note here to say that we're not just egalitarian during the Paleolithic because we have so little stuff. That certainly plays a role. People are constantly moving. They're subsistence hunter and gatherers, so they have no surplus. But it also seems to be a choice. This is based upon the work of Christopher Boehm, who did a large-scale analysis of over 28 different early societies. And he found that they had a range of different mechanisms, what he called counter-dominant strategies, to stop one individual from dominating the rest of the group. These range from ridicule, ostracism, and eventually, in the worst cases, in-group execution. That, of course, seems to change. How do we go from in-group execution of domineering individuals to eventually Cahokia? We see a really common trajectory across every region of the world. It varies in terms of when it starts, and it varies in terms of how long it takes, but the rough sequence is pretty much always the same. You have sedentism, you have the invention of things like pottery, irrigation, etc. Usually a couple thousand years later, you get large-scale warfare, the very first example being what's called the Halafians, a group in modern-day northern Mesopotamia, who try to monopolize the trade in obsidian. Obsidian was one of the key resources at the time, and they started to basically take over key choke points in the supply chain and build fortresses over the top of them. And once again, with different lags, sometimes it takes a couple of thousand years, sometimes far less, just a couple of hundred. After warfare, you start to get the emergence of the very first states. States, in this case, not being Weber's idea of a monopoly of lethal violence, but instead being a set of institutions, centralized institutions, which impose rules on and extract resources from a given population in a territory. So it's pretty clear in every case you have the intensification of agriculture, you have people settling down more and more, granted, in a process that takes thousands of years, you eventually get warfare, and then you get the state. How can we explain this? Well, one way to do so is to look across the world and ask, what's common across the areas where you get states? typical answer has always been agriculture. Whether it was Marx, Smith, or of course Jared Diamond, they often put forward this idea of once you get agriculture and you get a surplus, you start to be able to pay people to actually do things like ruling and administrating, for instance, and you also need those rulers and administrators to have a large, complex society. Things look a little bit tricky if we take this to heart. There's 10 different areas across the world that have had independent agriculture, but only 4 of them developed states. So we had the Wari Empire in Tiwanaku in Mesoamerica and the Andes. We have Montalban in Mesoamerica. In the Near East, we have both Uruk in Mesopotamia in the first dynasty of Egypt, and in China we have the Shah dynasty. All of those have agriculture, and yet there's numerous other ones that also have agriculture and never developed states. For instance, Papua New Guinea, they have agriculture at the same time as Egypt, roughly 7,000 years ago. The difference is Papua New Guinea were developing very different resources. They had taro and bananas, while in the case of Egypt, they had wheat. And it's worthwhile noting that there's similarities here to to the US as well. So the US didn't just have cities of farmers, they also had hunter-gatherers who organized themselves into dominance hierarchies. So for instance, there's the Calusa, who came across the south of modern-day Florida, who were essentially fisher folk. They had large catchments of fish, which they used to create a kind of very big dominance-based society with kind of large-scale buildings, including at least a couple of houses that could house hundreds of thousands of people. And they dominated a whole bunch of farmers around them, roughly, I think, 20 different villages. What explains the difference between the Calusa and other hunter-gatherers, or between Egypt and Papua New Guinea, is the type of resources they had access to, not just simply having a surplus. So think of Papua New Guinea. Banana and taro, the downside to them is they don't last very long. You can't store them for long. Banana you can only store for roughly a month after it's harvested, and taro roughly 6 months. Taro can also be very easily hidden. You can leave it underground even after its harvest period. By contrast, wheat advertises itself when it's ready to be harvested, and it can last for decades once you store it. The same is true of rice, corn, barley, and the other staple crops that were used in early states. And in the case of the Calusa, and also other more hierarchical hunter-gatherers across North America, such as on the Pacific Northwest coast, they had fish that they smoked, and hence could store. I call these lootable resources. In other words, resources that can be easily seen, stolen, and stored. So it wasn't just key to have agriculture and a surplus. You need to have an agriculture, a surplus, that could be easily appropriated. And that starts to explain quite a lot. Suddenly you can explain why you see the emergence of states across those 4 areas, not others. They had little resources. But even in the US and Canada, why some hunter-gatherers were hierarchical and not others. A review of at least 89 different societies found that the biggest explanatory factor for hierarchy and slavery was whether they had these clumped defensible resources, they call them. In other words, lootable resources. The other 2 factors are caged land and monopolized weapons. So in the Near East, you don't have the emergence of Uruk, the very first city-state in Mesopotamia, or the first dynasty of Egypt, until you have the introduction of bronze-held axes and swords. It's worth noting that most of these areas also tend to be what I call caged land. So Mesopotamia in Greek means the land between 2 rivers. It's cordoned off. And likewise, the first dynasty of Egypt occurs in a land which is buffered between the Nile and the Red Sea. It's a pretty clear picture that's emerging, that essentially once you had critical resources that most of the population was dependent upon, and one group had access to weapons that could be used to dominate others, and that people couldn't escape, suddenly they could use that to put up a large-scale state, empire, or kingdom. And this also helps to explain why you get not just one group dominating, but they also tend to pass it down across generations, which is what kind of distinguishes us from, say, for instance, gorillas or hierarchies of chimpanzees, is that our dominance hierarchies start to become intergenerational. I can kind of blow through that. But of course, the question is, why did some people try to dominate others? If most of us usually turn to these counter-dominant strategies and we like to have egalitarianism, why is it that some people always sought to dominate the rest of the group? In the book, I point towards a pretty robust evidence of psychology called status competition. That all of us, to some extent, desire status, but it's not universal. Some people want it much more than others. And status, importantly, across a large number of different case studies, has been shown to have a reproductive advantage. In short, people who have more status, who are more admired and respected in their groups, tend to have more children, and their children are much more likely to live on into adulthood. Here's a quick little good quote from a guy called Harold Huntington, who was an oil tycoon back in the 1920s and 30s, who said, "For practical purposes, someone who has $200,000 a year is just as well off as I am. Money's just a way of keeping score." And this seems to be a driving thing for a lot of people across history. It's not just simply having power, being on a throne, or having money, but it's the status that comes alongside of it. And importantly, as mentioned, not everyone wants status. There are some groups who want it much more than others, and importantly, are willing to use violence, force, and intimidation to reach it. This is what we call the dark triad, a group of 3 different antisocial characteristics, which everyone has to some extent, but some people rank much more highly than others. These include psychopathy, a lack of empathy and callousness, narcissism, an overinflated sense of self and ego, and Machiavellianism, a willingness to manipulate others for your own political gain. It's pretty hard to look at the modern world and not see these overrepresented when it comes to powerful individuals. Psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism. But apart from, obviously, this kind of meme-like joke, there's actually good studies suggesting that powerful people do tend to show these higher levels of the triad, including in one large-scale observational study of 148 US senators compared to the general population. And they seem to be really intent upon always making themselves seem as powerful as possible. I had a couple of different slides going through what's called the boast literature, so basically different Mesopotamian kings self-praising, but I thought I'd just settle for a very quick meme. Whenever you look at early state rulers, they have a terrible time just constantly self-aggrandizing themselves, and of course, usually claiming to be either gods or representative gods, which has, I guess, 2 benefits. One, it convinces people that the hierarchy they're in is natural and justified, but second, it is the ultimate status move. And status also helps to explain inequality and the way we see it manifest in the archaeological record. When archaeologists look for signs of inequality across the archaeological record, they tend to look for certain things, including large-scale monuments, particularly monuments that are not for public use. They look for burial goods, so things like jewelry, weapons, etc., which are buried of an individual, sometimes a retinue of people who are killed alongside an individual, and of course, human sacrifice itself. And all of these are signs of what we call conspicuous consumption. They're the use of energy and resources in a way that is not exactly beneficial for the group. It's essentially wasteful use of energy. And this is a pretty big change from most nomadic egalitarians who tend to have what we call the principle of least effort. This is an idea in anthropology that most nomadic egalitarians and even peasant farmers tend to be very scrupulous in the way they use their energy and tend to try to maximize leisure where they can. To the extent where peasant farmers will often do cash labor when it's necessary for a certain thing, like paying a dowry or marriage, but then will basically stop as soon as they've actually paid off what they need and will just go back to subsistence farming. This is the exact opposite of that. It's the large-scale, wasteful accumulation and use of energy. Conspicuous consumption. Status competition becomes incarnate. And we see this in the genetic record as well. Roughly somewhere between 8,000 to 4,000 years ago, as you get the intensification of agriculture, the emergence of warfare, and the emergence of the first states, you also see a big bottleneck in the Y chromosome. In other words, a small number of men were starting to monopolize reproduction. And when you actually look at the artwork, it's also quite clear that both status competition but also violence was key to the formation of states. This is called the Palette of Namur. It's, as far as we know, the main and original piece of artwork which talks about the beginning of the first dynasty of Egypt, Namur being its original leader. Here you can be seen bludgeoning what we think is a rival leader, and then essentially boasting in front of a group of decapitated corpses. Of course, of gods surrounding him to validate his victory. But this is pretty common. The very first emperor of the world, a fellow named Sargon, the first ruler of the Akkadian Empire, has very similar iconography in his victory stele. And interestingly, even Cahokia, there's been found a flint statue which depicts a warrior bashing in the head of a rival. And when you look at the archaeological record, it's also quite clear that violence seems to be pretty clear and important to both state formation, but also state collapse. This is from a large-scale study of roughly 12,000 years, beginning in the Neolithic and going all the way through to the early Iron Age. What you see are a couple of spikes in violence. First in the Chalcolithic, when you have the formation of the world's very first states, but also there's a spike in violence when you get the late Bronze Age collapse, the end of some of the big empires of the area. But interestingly, that spike in violence continues through to the Iron Age, when you have the formation of new big empires. So the claim I want to make here is that when we think about the violence of collapse, it's really about state formation. It's not a Hobbesian scramble with everyone killing each other. We have no evidence for that. Instead, it's usually small groups of armed young men trying to recreate a Goliath. Given time, I'll brush over that, but feel free in the questions section to ask me about Zomia. It's cool. And of course, we have to bear in mind that Goliaths, societies of domination, end up being the ones that we pay the most attention to. It's what I call the 1% view of history. It's easiest in the archaeological record to find things like cities, palaces, and temples and pyramids. It's much more difficult to dig up things which are A, biodegradable, like hunters and gatherers, and also people who often lived on farms. But that doesn't mean that they were the minority of history. Even at the very peak of Rome, roughly 90 to 95% of the population did not live in Rome the city, they were farmers. And importantly, the 1% tend to be the biggest victims of collapse. And it's really funny when you actually look at what's called the lamentation literature. So often this is literature, sets of poems that look back on a previous fallen empire and talk about its demise. And this is called the Admonitions of Ipuwer. It was written after the first intermediate period, basically the first collapse of pharaonic power in Egypt. And it's interesting they spend some time talking about how bad this was, that it led to cannibalism, mass starvation, warfare. We don't actually have any evidence that it did lead to those things. But they spend even more time lamenting the inversion of the social order. So here's a couple of lines from the Admonitions of Ipuwer. The corn of Egypt is common property. Indeed, the poor man has attained to the state of the 9 gods. He who could not make a sarcophagus for himself is now the possessor of a tomb. Behold, noble ladies are now on rafts, and magnates are in the labor establishment, while he who could not sleep, even on walls, is now the possessor of a bed. Servants spoke freely, the nobles lamented, and the poor rejoiced. Might be my class background. That doesn't sound that bad to me. But clearly for them, this was an absolutely horrible outcome that they wanted to warn against. And so hence, they linked the inversion of the social order and the regaining of equality to something horrible, something close to an apocalypse. So that's always worthwhile keeping in mind, is that both the archaeological artifacts, but also even writing, which was only ever done by a very small sliver of humanity, usually a kind of small number of scribes who were employed by kings and the rich, that's where we get most of our view of history from. So that's state formation, rise. Let's quickly move on to collapse. When we speak of collapse, we have to bear in mind that we're talking about risk. And risk is determined by 4 different factors we call the 4 determinants of risk: hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and response. Think of it this way. If you're hit by a tsunami, the tsunami, which causes damage, is your hazard. Your vulnerability is the fact that you don't have infrastructure, housing that can withstand the tsunami. Your exposure is, of course, the fact that you're standing in the path of the tsunami, and your response can either worsen things or make them far better. In the case of the Boxing Day tsunami in Bali, 2004, it made them far, far worse. When people saw the shoreline receding, which is a common indicator of a tsunami, they actually went out to inspect what was happening, leaving themselves more exposed to the oncoming tsunami, tragically. When we think about collapse, one of the main narratives in different books, ranging from Jared Diamond's collapse to many others, is that it's caused by environmental degradation and by climatic change. And it's easy to see why. There's a number of different case studies where when you see climatic change, when you see in particular droughts and periods of cooling, it seems to correlate with periods of imperial fall and collapse. This is from what's called the early Bronze Age collapse, when a number of different empires and kind of cultural zones throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East seem to all coincide with the onset of a mega drought, roughly 4,200 years ago. Harvey Weiss in particular has been a very big proponent that the mega drought triggered the collapse of all these different kingdoms and empires. You see a very similar thing when it comes to the late Bronze Age. So eventually the empires recuperate and they create a very large, one could even say thriving, set of interlinked empires who are trading not just goods, but also often daughters, sons, in a diplomatic network. And they all roughly start to fall apart during what a mega drought 3,200 years ago. And here's a quick little overview of all the different sites that are destroyed throughout the late Bronze Age collapse, roughly 12,000 years ago, or as my friend Eric Klein likes to put it, in 1177 BCE. That's his key date. Obviously, it actually takes around about 100 years for all these sites to go under. But climate is not a full explanation across these case studies. So first of all, it's worth noting this wasn't an apocalypse. So in the case of the early Bronze Age, in Egypt, you just see a dispersal of pharaonic power. As we saw with the admonitions of Ipuwer, this largely meant that people had more access to, say, for instance, tombs and kind of elite goods. It wasn't by any means a complete and utter collapse. And importantly, you see a lot of variation. So across all the case studies, you'll notice that some empires actually survive and take much longer to fall apart than others. And importantly, the actual climatic proxies don't always line up perfectly. So in the case of the late Bronze Age collapse, one of the societies that falls apart is the Mycenae, who are basically a collection of kind of Greek warlords. And in the different climatic areas near Pylos, which is one of the main palatial structures, we actually see that the wetter conditions prior to the collapse, and the drought happens after they collapse. You see the same when it comes to the collapse of the Maya as well. There's numerous city-states who don't seem to experience a drought whatsoever, but collapse, and others who experience very severe drought and yet don't collapse. And importantly, in the case of Greece, you actually have numerous areas in the north that don't seem to go through a collapse whatsoever. So Corinthia, Achaea, and the Iberian Gulf don't collapse, and importantly, those are all areas which are essentially egalitarian. They're not hierarchical city-states. The Puebloan communities we mentioned earlier, the first farmers in the American Southwest, they go through these different what are called termination or crisis periods in 700, 890, 1145, and 1285 CE. And granted, each of those does roughly coincide with drought. But interestingly, it also coincides with periods of growing wealth inequality and growing oppression. And essentially, after every crisis period, more or less, inequality is reversed. So the collapse or the crisis actually causes an increase in wealth equality. And I think this actually becomes a really strong explanatory factor, is how inclusive and how equal the society was. Can it help us understand why some areas and some societies could weather climatic change much more effectively than others? Before we go into why, it's worthwhile noting that most pre-modern states were not particularly egalitarian places. One review led by Branko Milanovic looked at 28 different states and found that they were on average roughly 77%, so 3/4 of the way, towards a maximum level of theoretical inequality. That maximum level of theoretical inequality is essentially when you have a condition where one person owns the entire surplus of a society. So they were grossly unequal, and this includes Rome, which was also 3/4 of the way towards the theoretical maximum by the time of its peak empire. And importantly, inequality seems to increase over time. This is for a couple of different reasons. One is simply that as you become more powerful and you have more wealth, as a general rule of thumb, despite some exceptions, you tend to have an ability to amass more wealth and more power. In the modern world, of course, if you're sufficiently wealthy, you can hire lobbyists who can basically read the rules in your favor, you can influence politicians, but you also tend to own lots of capital. And this is also the second key reason. Capital, whether it's in the form of stocks and shares or land historically, tends to increase more quickly in value than wages do. So in general, there will be a growing gap between the rich and the poor. There's some exceptions we can go into, but as a general rule of thumb, this is a pretty strong heuristic. And importantly, wealth inequality tends to spill into other domains. The wealthy, because of status competition, aren't usually fond of just keeping their money in their bank accounts. They like to usually take public office and try to become emperors or kings themselves. And interestingly, this becomes a pretty strong explanatory factor for the collapse of many early societies. So this is a set of different case studies of very early cities, including in San Lorenzo in modern-day Mesoamerica, Monte Alban, Gene in Africa, Teotihuacan, also Mesoamerica, Tiwanaku in the Andes. In every single case, they actually begin as egalitarian cities and egalitarian settlements. They have irrigation, they have large-scale monuments and infrastructure without necessarily having rulers or even large-scale wealth inequality. Once you start to get the emergence of a ruling class and wealth inequality intensifies, it's usually within the space of a couple of decades to a century they start to fall apart. And interestingly, many of these cases, such as the case of San Lorenzo, Tiwanaku, and Teotihuacan, the collapse seems to be a revolution. There's a very direct targeting of elite iconography, elite residences, and elite monuments as well. And notably, this is also roughly true of a whole bunch of the case studies we went through of North America. So Cahokia, Monte Alban, you actually start to see growing levels of wealth inequality prior to their kind of periods of collapse. So this becomes a pretty strong explanatory factor as to why you start to see some societies more vulnerable to climatic change than others. And it's worthwhile noting this is part of, I'll stay there, a larger set of literature. So Peter Peregrine at Yale University has done, I think, at least 3 different large-scale quantitative analyses looking at sets of different societies during different climatic events throughout history, including one, I think, of over 40 different societies during what's called the Little Ice Age in the late Antique Ice Age. Across these different studies, the key thing that he found is that societies that were more inclusive tended to experience less social change when facing a period of climatic change. And social change in this case means it's everything all the way from people moving en masse, assassinations, political instability, changes in the regime type, through to, of course, large-scale depopulation. But in short, more inclusive societies, and usually more equal ones, were less likely to go through large-scale change when they faced a climatic shock in comparison to ones which are more usually unequal, hierarchical, and exclusive in their governance structures. We all see the same when it comes to modern-day disaster risk management. One of the largest scale case studies done on what makes societies more resilient to modern-day disasters, whether it be hurricanes, earthquakes, or droughts, found that the 2 biggest explanatory factors were the capacity of the state, but that wasn't the strongest one. The other one was how democratic they were, essentially how inclusive they were. In other words, the biggest quantitative studies we have both of the past and of the modern world suggest that more inclusive societies tend to be better at weathering different kinds of external shocks. And importantly, in the book I put forward the case that inequality and growing concentrations of power, what you call extractive institutions, also make a society more fragile. So it's not just that equality tends to create resilience and robustness, but inequality tends to lead to greater fragility. Given time constraints, I won't go too in depth here, but here's a kind of rough schematic of all the different knock-on effects that can be linked to inequality. So Peter Turchin has this idea of structured demographic theory, which he's pioneered across a large number of different historical case studies, putting forward the case that inequality tends to lead to a society that's more top-heavy. You don't just have elites, but you tend to have more and more elites. And as you get more and more elites, they tend to compete more intensely for a limited number of high-status positions. We also know from the modern world that corruption and inequality tend to have a bi-directional relationship. In other words, societies who are more corrupt tend to be more unequal, and vice versa, societies more unequal tend to be more corrupt. I can also, one other thing I'll briefly mention is this also seems to play a role in terms of what I would call declining energy ratio, what other people would call environmental degradation. So, for instance, during the collapse of Rome, you do see signs of environmental degradation, including, for instance, their silver mines start to be depleted. That has pretty big knock-on effects as they start to have less and less silver from their mines in Spain. It means they have to debase their currency. They have to have less silver in every single coin. As the coins become less valuable, they start to underpay their military, and that, of course, is something that helps to lead to the coups, including by the Vandals. And that, in large part, can be traced back to, once again, a large number of elites who basically need more and more elite items, including those in silver, leads to, eventually, environmental depletion. I'll move through that pretty quickly, because I want to make sure we have time for talking about the future. So inequality, I would say, is still very central to thinking about existential risk and global societal collapse today. While in the past I pointed towards inequality leading to these internal dynamics that make societies more fragile over time, they tend to become more corrupt, they tend to overexploit their environment, they tend to have a larger and larger elite class competing for resources, and of course inequality by nature tends to be more corrosive to societies. I think that what happens today is slightly different. What I'm worried about is less the US falling apart, for instance, which is the most common question I always receive is what's going to happen to the US. I'm much more interested in see how does inequality underpin the biggest risks we face today, what many of my friends and colleagues would call existential threats. Things like AI, climatic change, even lethal autonomous weapons, aka killer robots. I want to take you to the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC provides roughly 70% of the world's cobalt. Cobalt is used in batteries, it's used in computers, it's a very critical resource for essentially any kind of high-level, modernized, advanced technology. Importantly, most of that cobalt is mined in borderline slave-like conditions. Many of the people work on roughly $3 to $4 per day. I think there's roughly 40,000 child laborers, and they're often what we call artisanal miners. In other words, miners work in conditions that lack regulation, including in tunnels which are prone to collapsing. Eventually, that cobalt they dig up, some of it will be put into drones that will speed across Libya at the speed of roughly 72 kilometers per hour until they spot a target and dive down to 122 kilometers per hour into a target, and they'll have explosives next to that cobalt. It's what we call a lethal autonomous weapon, basically a drone that can actively select its own target and kill it without human approval. Some of that cobalt will end up in a large language model, just across the bay in OpenAI, for instance. And of course, some of it will end up in batteries that are powering our renewable energy economy. And it's not just cobalt that relies upon economic exploitation and inequality to create global threats. Who knows of Shinkolobwe? So Shinkolobwe is the world's purest uranium mine, also found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Some of you may have heard of the Manhattan Project, so the world's quest, or the US's quest, I should say, to build the first atomic weapon. Roughly 3/4 to 80% of the uranium used in the Manhattan Project came from Shinkolobwe. It was struck with a deal with the Belgian colonizers, basically get low-cost uranium, and that ended up being not just in the world's very first atomic bomb detonated in Los Angeles, New Mexico, the Trinity Project, but also in the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. So when you think about existential threats, it's important not just to think about these as sets of individual hazards that are thrown up randomly by technology. They're built upon a global economic system, what I call the global Goliath, and they essentially rely upon both inequality and large-scale exploitation. Now, when we say existential, it's a term of art. What we're basically referring to are threats that could cause either, at the very worst, human extinction or some kind of global societal collapse. The kind of threshold we often use is talking about a global catastrophic risk. In other words, an event or process that could kill off more than 10% of the population in the space of decades to centuries, or the space of decades to a century. It's worth noting we've had at least some historical cases where we've lost roughly 10% of the global population, such as the invasion of the Americas, for instance, but we never seem to have ones that go significantly beyond that. And these different threats are all interlinked. I don't think we should be asking questions like, could climate change or could nuclear weapons cause a global societal collapse or human extinction? Because ultimately they are interlinked. This is from a piece of research I did back in 2022 of a large number of both ecological modelers and climate scientists, where basically we tried to project areas of the world are going to experience a mean annual temperature of 29 degrees Celsius under a medium to high emission scenario by 2075. 29 degrees mean annual temperature is a temperature that only roughly 200 million people experience today. And those are people who almost always live more nomadic lifestyles in places like the Sahara and the Persian Gulf. They don't usually live in urban, industrialized areas. By 2075, those heat domes could cover roughly 2 billion people. And what we've done here is we've overlaid that with both the Fragile States Index, a measurement of basically how politically fragile different areas are, as well as with the capitals of different nuclear powers and what are called biosafety level set 4 facilities. Biosafety level 4 facilities are those labs which are working on the world's most dangerous pathogens. And there's a really clear overlap that areas which experience these very big heat domes in the future tend to be the world's most fragile politically, so such as the Horn of Africa, for instance. It also covers roughly 2, almost 3 nuclear powers and 7 different biosafety levels 4 facilities. So all these different things we talk about, both in terms of the production, but also in terms of the consequences, are deeply interlinked. We're talking about one level of existential risk emergent from one global economic system. And given time, I'm just going to focus on one particular threat we face today, which is, of course, climate change. In the past, most of the climatic changes that triggered or played a role in some kind of collapse were usually roughly 1 degree, usually less. Interestingly, they were more often cooling rather than warming, and they were often at a regional rather than a global level. Today, we face a rather different beast. The world has already warmed by, at least on long-term projections, roughly 1.3 degrees Celsius, but there's been an acceleration of warming which may be temporary, but it seems not to be, and that would put us already past 1.5 degrees Celsius. In the future, estimates vary, but we're looking at probably an increase all the way from somewhere around about, if we have large-scale technologies to take down carbon dioxide, maybe 1.5 if we can take down a huge amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but probably something closer to 3 to 5.5 degrees Celsius, depending upon the sensitivity of the Earth, as well as, of course, the emissions of our own society. And it's worth noting this has a very long history. We often talk about this idea of the Anthropocene. Who's roughly familiar with the idea of the Anthropocene? Yeah, so it's the idea that we're going through a geological epoch in which humans become the major driver of environmental change at a global level. And one thing that has happened recently is a lot of archaeologists and historians have started to point towards the fact that humans have had a continuous impact upon our ecologies for a long period of time. Roughly 800,000 years ago, perhaps even as early as 1 million years ago, hominids were making use of fire. And fire helped to recultivate and reshape, remold landscapes at a very large regional level. But when you think about this in terms of land use change, there's a really clear picture that emerges. One is that the really big increases happen as you start to get the intensification of agriculture and, of course, the rise of the world's very first states. And then interestingly, the biggest changes you see thereafter tend to be linked to both A, colonization, and then B, what's called the Great Acceleration. Basically, the period after World War II in the 1950s and 60s as the US cements its global hegemony. But the key thing here is you basically get the expansion of empires who take up more and more energy from the system and reshape the world. That graph looks pretty similar when you look at global economic activity, global GDP, and also even when you just look at energy capture over time, which of course the brunt of which has come from hydrofluorocarbons. But it's worthwhile noting here that what we're talking about is not that the Anthropocene is driven by everyone. First of all, it's worth noting that when we talk about the Anthropocene, we often get caught up in these big debates of did it start in 1954, did it start in 1945? Some people put forward that it started during the invasion of the Americas in the 1500s. I'd say that the Anthropocene is a spectrum. It's a process. It has a very slow, very thin beginning. When you start to get the intensification of agriculture, it speeds up when you get colonization, and of course it speeds up even further during the Great Acceleration. But it's a process of intensification rather than being a single point. But importantly, the Anthropocene and even climate change is not equally distributed in terms of responsibility. Roughly 75%, 3/4 of global cumulative emissions come from just 10 countries. That's if you count the European Union as one country. Roughly 25% comes from just one country. You could probably guess who. Yeah, the United States. And it's worthwhile noting that's true of most of the big threats we think about. Likewise, nuclear weapons, 85% of the stockpile, 87% is held by just two countries, Russia and the US. And AI, if you're really worried about AI becoming in some way agentic and killing off humans, there's only really three big labs you have to worry about. OpenAI, DeepMind, and Anthropic, all of which are headquartered in the US. And even when you take a different perspective, not looking at countries, but looking at, say, for instance, private companies, it's once again clear that it's highly concentrated. 57 companies since 2016, basically during the ratification of the Paris Agreement, have been responsible for 80% of industrial emissions. If you look at this in terms of the richest 1%, they're responsible for more emissions than the bottom 66% of humanity. And at least one study looking across 5 what some people call planetary boundaries, things like biosphere integrity, roughly the top 10% are responsible for 31 to 67% of degradation across those boundaries. And importantly, it's the very powerful companies and people behind them who seem to be hamstringing our responses to them as well. So in the 1970s, Exxon knew about climate change. It did its own modeling around what's called equilibrium climate sensitivity, how sensitive climate is to doubling of CO2 concentrations. They then intentionally buried that information. And thereafter ran misinformation campaigns to cast doubt on the science of climate change. 3M and DuPont, chemical manufacturers who produce chemicals that have now been shown to both have effects on fertility and be carcinogenic, did the similar thing back in the 1970s. I'll move through this pretty quickly. When you look at the Anthropocene, this kind of long-term increase in our destruction of the environment, you start to see very similar trends when you look at other threats. So in here, I've modeled the most powerful weapons at different historical periods in terms of the amount of joules they release, different projectiles, across time. And you see quite clearly that basically GDP has very reliably been turned into increasing explosive, destructive power. So to wrap up, I want to first of all note that obviously there's much more in the book. This is just a very small glimmer of what I try to cover in the book, but that inequality is both fundamental to the rise of the societies we live in today, what I call Goliaths, what others have called civilization. Inequality seems to grow over time, and it seems to play a very big explanatory factor into why societies seem to become more vulnerable over time. And even today, the biggest threats that we face are built upon large-scale global economic inequality. If you paid miners in the DRC proper wages, suddenly it would be much, much harder to build things like nuclear weapons and even large language models. So inequality and, of course, climate change are central to the human story, not just to the rise of our very first societies, but also their fall. And it may be also central to our future. Cool, I'll finish up there and hopefully we'll have still a fair bit of time for question and answers. So, questions? Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, sorry. So, you mentioned that like a lot of cases that you mentioned about societal collapse quite early on were in quite like rigid societies. Do you think that like the rise of greater social mobility in the modern day has any influence on like collapse as you see it in like the 21st century, or is it not as much of a factor?
Ooh, that's a good question. One would expect that it should essentially make overall politics more inclusive and hence be essentially kind of an alleviating effect on the corrosive effect of inequality. I've yet to see any really good studies on this, but most of these tend to be just looking at wealth inequality rather than social mobility per se. Most of the things I talk about, such as corruption, for instance, and structural demographic theory, as far as I know, they're not influenced heavily by social mobility.
If you look at the way kind of the current global landscape is spoken about in terms of the US versus China, whether it comes to LLMs or whether it comes to supremacy for various climate materials, etc. How do we combat that? Because like it seems like the existential threats are persisting and will persist, but the causes of them are due to this competition.
Yeah, so in the book, I try to think about existential risks from a point of view of what are the root causes. So rather than just thinking of the end threats, AI, climate change, nuclear weapons, etc., you can also think about the producers. So you can think about the fossil fuel industry, big tech, military industrial complexes. You can then think of what are the forces driving them, and most people would say arms races. Whether it's OpenAI justifying its latest model changes, or of course the nuclear modernization in the US, it's usually justified as well. We have to because we have competitors, and if we don't build it, someone else will. And it becomes a question of what's the root cause behind that. And something I discuss in the book is that when it comes to game theory, which is the main explanatory factor for arms races, we don't have good evidence that game theory really applies to everyone. When you actually put people into game theoretic arms races, they don't tend to end up in arms races in most laboratory settings. And there's been numerous societies throughout history which have operated as peace systems, basically ones which don't seem to engage in arms races. The same is true of the tragedy of the commons, which you've probably all heard of, the idea if you have common resources, unless you have either an overarching arbiter or some other kind of like punitive force, people will, in pursuit of their individual self-interest, tend to collectively overexploit that resource. Interestingly, in laboratory experiments, if you give people simply the ability to communicate, you don't get a tragedy of the commons. And similarly, we all know there's been lots of societies, and particularly indigenous ones, that haven't had tragedy of the commons type dynamics. Khoisan people lived in the Kalahari for over 200,000 years. We don't see any signs of long-term environmental degradation. There are two groups of people who seem more likely to defect and to basically lead to these arms races and game theoretic problems. One is, interestingly, people who've been educated in finance and economics. Makes sense. You basically start to view the world as everyone's an asshole, hence I can be as well. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the second is, interestingly enough, dark triad once again. People who rank higher in narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism are more likely to affect and trigger those dynamics as well. And I put forward the case that our Goliath systems, they don't tend to select for the best of us. They select for people who want status, and hence you start to get an over-representation of dark triad, also usually people in finance and economics as well. And once you start to get a couple of actors which defect, a couple of empires, then suddenly that sets up a chain dynamic. And it's very easy for that to become a self-fulfilling prophecy thereafter. But the key thing is, this is not something that happens to all humans or all human systems. It's something that happens to certain kinds of human systems. And unfortunately, those are the kinds that we have elevated at the global stage.
Luke, we have a bit of a queue. If it's okay, I'm going to bundle 3 questions.
Yeah, sure.
Not too acrobatic, I hope. Okay, here, and over there.
Mine is actually really related to what you were just talking about, which is I'm trying to figure out how does this make sense evolutionarily speaking,
Right.
that we continue to have these collapses and that inequality creates societies that are more fragile and vulnerable. Would there not be like this pressure towards groups that are more resilient to risk of societal collapse?
Yeah, great question. Well done, Amanda.
Thanks for the talk. I think my question relates to sort of just like bridging the parts of your talk. So you kind of present these comparative cases of collapse which had like some kind of hopeful reduction in inequality that followed. So could you kind of just speak more to this global Goliath collapse, and especially with respect to an increased dependencies across global capital markets?
Yep.
Great. Thanks so much for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I was just curious if you, in the book, look at all. It looks like you have a matrix of like collapse versus not collapse. Were there any cases of like an off ramp where you had societies approaching collapse, maybe akin to the modern world, where there's an off ramp and societies have successfully shifted to the other pathway?
We have one more over here if you want to take 4. Make it extra difficult.
Okay. And Jonas, we'll give you the last question, I suppose, to wrap things up. You said that you saw, right, Meg?
I thought one of you two had your hands up.
Absolutely, Meg did. Yeah.
Oh,
Did I miss anybody else that I can at least feel guilty about?
Thanks so much for your talk. This is somewhat connected, I think, to your question as well. But I think I'm thinking through sort of the geographic leap that you're making from the past to the future around sort of the global society versus, all of these various case studies. And I particularly think of the case of the DRC and the Congo. And there, the sanctioning and all of that is so hard also because it's so hidden. And so the geographic stretching is so extreme across these global economies.
Yeah.
And so kind of what do you think are some of the challenges in thinking at a global scale about a global society as compared to some of your earlier cases? Kind of help me with that a little bit and the ways that we can draw from that, but also might be some of the limitations in that geographic or in that scalar jump.
Yep, cool. Okay, so first of all, evolutionarily, why haven't we seen a selection against large-scale more unequal societies if they tend to become more fragile over time? The key thing here is that the selection pressure has been more for who's most effective at conquering others. And just pretty clear cut, large-scale dominance hierarchies have been better at it. There's different theories as to why. Some people like Peter Turchin would say that you need a hierarchy in order to effectively run a military, and that more hierarchical societies eventually have larger, more effective militaries, and they're tempted to conquer the others. And even if they do fall apart, they're the ones who leave both their ideas, their artifacts, technology, etc. on for others. There's a reason why we harken back to Rome, and even why if you walk around Washington, a whole bunch of the architecture looks very Romanesque. It's because of Rome was pretty much the most effective military power ever in Europe. There's other theories. I mean, I would say that this could be as simple as you only tend to get really militaristic societies when they are very hierarchical. I won't go too in depth for psychological reasons as to why, but the key thing is that Goliaths just have been much more effective at large-scale military conquest. And so even if they do collapse eventually, they tend to be the ones that grow much larger and are selected for over time. So that would be the kind of rough evolutionary argument. And in terms of what's different today, in terms of particularly like global vulnerability, interconnectedness, and I think this actually has a really good overlap with Beck's question, things definitely are different. I think a good critique of a lot of the past collapse literature is they're often looking at case studies which are very isolated, and hence you can kind of look at the causal factors more easily, but they're also far less analogous to the modern world. Jared Diamond famously looks at 5 case studies in his book Collapse, and apart from all the problems of his actual analysis, 3 of them are islands. One is the Maya, who exists in a fragile topsoil and very unique tropical environment, and the other one, the Plebeians of the Southwest. I think one more analogous case would be the late Bronze Age collapse, which Eric Klein covers a lot. The key thing here being that both are highly interconnected, not as interconnected as today, and their connections are much more visible than the kind of more latent invisible ones today. But importantly, their interconnectedness seems to play a role potentially in their collapse. Eric recently finished a study with some others looking at how many empires would you need to collapse in the late Bronze Age for the entire system to become destabilized. And it basically came down to all you really required was Ugarit, a key trading hub, plus the Hittite Empire, and they seem to be roughly collapsing at the same time. But the key idea here being, and this comes from a larger body of literature in both finance and complexity science, once you have a sufficiently interconnected system, particularly when it's dependent more upon a couple of hubs called free-scale networks, it basically becomes more resilient to small perturbations, but more vulnerable to very large ones. So if you have a highly interconnected financial system, it's really good at buffering when small things happen. But if you have a sufficiently large shock, like a collapse in the housing market in the US, it's more likely to be amplified across the system. In the book, I suggest that we're maybe looking at a similar thing when it comes to modern day political instability. That at least the best studies of modern day state failure suggest that you don't have a state failure which lasts longer than 6 months. In places like Somalia, Sudan, etc., within 6 months, some semblance of a monopoly on lethal violence and a legislative body is usually back in place. State failure doesn't tend to last very long. And part of that is because the international community immediately mobilizes against it. You have aid, you also have interventions, usually to reinstate a government. No one likes a stateless area. And that means it doesn't tend to last long. But the catch being that the world is also far more dependent upon a couple of both key breadbasket producers. 6% of calories come from just 4 different crops, which are concentrating their production. And of course, likewise, when it comes to finances, only a couple of countries basically prop up the entire economic system, places such as the US and China. So in the book, I put forward the idea of the Death Star syndrome. That basically, like the Death Star, which seems impregnable, if you hit it in the right spot, potentially things fall apart quite quickly. But the good news is it's better against smaller shocks. In terms of the kind of invisibility of the interconnections, that's something honestly I haven't thought about too much. And I think it's psychologically one of the reasons why it's so easy to justify the production of these big risks is, people don't think about the role that very cheap uranium played when it came to the production of the world's first atomic weapons, or the role that very cheap cobalt plays in both large language models and lethal autonomous weapons. So I think it provides a kind of social and psychological distance, which makes it much more easy to produce these threats in the first place. Yep. And the very last question, which was, no, don't fail me now, brain. What's that? Yes, off-ramps. I was going to get there. There's been a good study by Peter Turchin and Dan Hoyer. So they run the world's largest online repository of historical information, known as the SESHAT database. And they also have one particular one called the Crisis Database, which looks at over 100 cases of different historical crisis events. And they tried to point towards 4 different cases of reform. Basically, you had increasing wealth inequality, an increasing elite class, things seemed to be becoming more politically unstable, but then it averted a crisis. And one of these was, I think, the 1920s and 30s United States, the Gilded Age essentially you have. And part of the story there is the world wars, what some people call the Great Compression. So basically globally, but also in places like the US, you have a huge reduction in wealth inequality due to the world wars, both the large-scale destruction of capital, but also because of the policies that were put in place during the wartime economy. But even before the world wars, you actually had a whole bunch of different policies, particularly around unionization, that were addressing inequality and also encouraging things like social mobility. And their key argument is that at least some elites become aware of the fact that the system and that is rigged towards benefiting them is not in their own interests. It's going to lead to some kind of catastrophe. And they start to become more accepting of potential reform mechanisms. The downside is across all of those 4 case studies, they don't last long. Eventually the wealth pump kicks back in, inequality, extractive institutions tend to grow once again. So they couldn't actually point out towards anyone where it was a long-lasting effect. The one I'd point towards actually is a collapse type one. After the collapse of the earliest Goliaths here, the hunter-gatherers of Native Americans, they actually seem to adopt particular types of strategies, including the stories we spoke about, but also they return more towards hunting and gathering and have much more democratic systems. And at least some, like Kathleen Duval, suggest this was a way of making sure that Goliaths and inequality didn't emerge at scale again. Jonas.
It was incredibly fascinating, such a sweeping tour that you gave us. I want to close with a quote from the back of the book by the author Yuval Hari. Deeply sobering and strangely inspiring. Read it now or your descendants will find it in their roots. For that, thank you for coming us and giving us such a fascinating.